With add-ons currently on the chopping block and class design and boss encounters being completely reworked, is WoW going to have any room for skill expression left? Retail World of Warcraft in its current state is extremely hard to break into. After 21 years, the player base has grown in skill level immensely. Rotations that started as just single button spells have now turned into complex arrangements of buttons with weak auras and trackers to get them right. To counter this, Blizzard has responded with increasingly complex encounters to the point where playing the game without these add-ons is borderline impossible. But as of now, Blizzard is attempting to reverse that arms race. They're curbing many of the combat add-ons and streamlining classes and encounters to lower the barrier for entry. That's great for approachability, but what happens to skill expression and game mastery amongst all of this? In this video, I'm going to unpack how skill floors and skill ceilings impact our experience with the game as a whole, what risks come with fiddling with these dials a little bit too much, and what we can do as a community to help guide Blizzard in the right direction and ultimately make the game a more pleasant and enjoyable experience for players across the entire spectrum of skill. So to start, let's just define some terms real quickly. First up, we have skill ceiling. This is the upper limit of performance. This is how far mastery can theoretically go. We usually will infer this by watching like the best players in the world. We think of Liquid and Echo's Race to World First Raiders, or front page M+ pushers like Kira or Elismir. In general, the more decision dense a class or a set of encounters becomes, the higher the theoretical ceiling goes. On the flip side, we have the skill floor. This is like the baseline level of performance that someone needs to play at to be able to engage with the game in general. Now, this is kind of tricky to define with WoW because the skill floor actually changes depending on the type of content that you're doing. If we think LFR, the skill floor for this is relatively low, basic understanding of movement and what buttons to press and some understanding of the boss. Whereas if we look at high-end Mythic rating, the skill floor is a lot higher. There's a lot more that needs to be understood. We can also add in the personal skill ceiling. This is slightly different to absolute ceilings as it's more impacted by personal factors. The absolute skill ceiling is the theoretical maximum level that anybody could play at, whereas the personal skill ceiling is more dictated by factors such as age or natural ability or how much time that you can actually put into the game. If we think about it this way, someone who is in their early 20s and doesn't have a job and lives in their mum's basement probably has a much higher personal skill ceiling as opposed to a 40-year-old father of 4 who works 60 hours a week. And then we have just individual player skill as it stands. So every single player is going to fit somewhere within this framework, and our enjoyment of the game will be pretty heavily dictated by where we fit in this. So let's take a look at how this plays out in-game and how tuning these factors can either enhance our experience with WoW or completely destroy it. With all of the overlapping mechanics and complex class designs and endgame systems and things like that, it is pretty safe to assume that the skill floor at the moment is, say, somewhere around here. It's relatively high. Alongside this, the skill ceiling, as in the reflection of true mastery, is arguably not even possible to be achieved by a real player. This, to me, is very reminiscent of the game of chess. For those who are unaware, at the moment, the theoretical maximum potential of performance in chess is normally only achieved by complex AI bots, and humans are very, very much behind that just because of the amount of information that needs to be processed. So WoW definitely sort of fits into this category where the true potential is a lot higher than what any individual player can actually achieve themselves. Now, there is a slight problem here as it stands. With the skill floor being at the level that it's currently at, the approachability of the game in general is actually really difficult for new players. Let's take M+ as an example. For someone to engage with this system, they need to level their class to 80. They need to have a basic understanding of the game design, stats and gearing and things like that. They need to have an understanding of their class and how to play it appropriately. They need to understand the dungeon, what the mechanics are in it, how each of the classes interact with one another. They need to know how their class abilities interact with the dungeon mechanics, and probably other things that I haven't thought of as well. Now, to accomplish this, a lot of the time, it is almost required that weak auras and add-ons are installed and used, because there's just so much information going on that for a player approaching this from a non-competitive standpoint, it's extremely difficult to actually get into. And even for players like myself who have played this game for years and play at quite a high level, it's even hard for me. It's hard for pretty much all of us, if we're being perfectly honest. So for anyone who isn't at a bare minimum like a veteran from a previous expansion, this is a really tall order, and it leads to a situation where new players are few and far between. For the health of a game, and WoW is no exception, we do need new players and returning players to be able to access the game appropriately. As time goes on, older and more experienced players will just naturally drop off. We need fresh blood to keep the player base alive. In that sense, reducing the skill floor is actually a really good idea, and I think Blizzard are really on the ball with this. We want the game to be as accessible to as many players as possible. And this is basically what they're attempting to do. At the moment, weak auras and add-ons are basically community-level attempts to drag down the skill floor. However, a game that relies exclusively on these is actually not really well designed. Removing the need for them actually does make a lot of sense. However, there are some consequences that need to be considered as they're going about this. In removing complexity, the skill ceiling will also in turn fall with it. In WoW and basically any game, a lot of individuals will derive a lot of joy from the process of obtaining mastery. I don't mean the secondary stat, I mean mastery of the game. In any hobby, the constant drive to improve is what drives engagement for a lot of people. It feels good to be good at something. The old saying of nothing good in life comes easy does ring true with WoW as much as it does with other things. So there's a fine balance that needs to be struck, removing the barrier for entry while still allowing for mastery and skill expression to survive. Let's use a sport like soccer as an example. Let's say, hypothetically, that they decide to add a new accessibility rule that allows every single player on the field to have an open shot at goal at the end of each half. Now, while this would cause accessibility to be much better, so the skill floor would go down dramatically, it would also drag the skill ceiling down significantly and remove any sort of competitive edge that the sport sort of evokes. On the flip side, let's say at a grassroots like club level, they decide to add a grade of play that has smaller fields and less pressure to perform. So sort of like a social game, I guess. In the first scenario, competitive integrity is eroded pretty substantially, but in the second, skill expression is still maintained while accessibility has increased. The skill floor has dropped, but the ceiling has maintained where it currently is. And I think this is exactly what Blizzard is trying to do. And I think this is what we as a community need to try and help them to do. While there is a vocal minority online at the moment who is sort of pushing back against these changes, now is definitely not the time to be acting like a typical angry Redditor, just crying about Blizzard neutering the game or whatever. Simplification is not necessarily a bad thing. We just need to provide critiques and feedback throughout the process to allow Blizzard to be able to tune the knobs effectively. And look, I will admit, I was quite worried about this when I heard about the proposed changes. I wasn't sure that I trusted Blizzard to be able to increase accessibility and lower the skill floor without ruining the competitive elements of the game that I actually really love engaging with. I agree, accessibility is needed in a game like WoW, but if it comes at the expense of depth, then any meaning in any achievements that we obtain in game effectively evaporates. In saying that, I do think Blizzard is actually on the ball here and understands this well. Some classes have already made pretty positive transitions in this direction. I think Retribution Paladin was arguably the first sort of iteration of this more simplified class design. This occurred back in Dragonflight, and I think that's just been universally well received. It's currently the most played spec in the entire game by a long margin. And this does make sense. The skill floor for Ret is quite low. It's easy to pick up. However, there is still room to be able to differentiate yourself from other players in terms of pressing your buttons faster or understanding where to use your utility. As a more recent example, Frost DK has sort of received this treatment as well. And from what I can gather, this has almost universally been well received by the community as a whole. So in that vein, I think Blizzard is actually doing a really good thing. As I mentioned earlier, the skill floor is way too high at the moment. However, the skill ceiling is also almost unattainably high. So there is a margin for error. They are able to tune both of them downwards a little bit. Let's think of it this way. The Race to World First Raiders on Mythic End bosses, even with the same gear, are taking hundreds and hundreds of pulls to even get a single kill. That is a reflection of a skill ceiling that is extremely high. Now, the challenge in front of Blizzard is to attempt to maintain the height of this skill ceiling, or at least keep it close to where it currently is, while reducing the floor a little bit. And we can help with this. Even in the Midnight Alpha, Blizzard has shown that they are very much willing to make class design changes based on feedback from players. Community input is really important at the moment. While Blizzard has a level of understanding of their game that doesn't really compare to the understanding of individual players, especially those who have put hundreds and hundreds of hours into specific classes or specific specs. Now, I don't mean just go on Reddit and cry about any changes that happen. What I mean is providing Blizzard with genuine feedback, either positive or negative, from the perspective of someone who engages with the game at a very deep level. Blizzard won't know what is working unless the player base actually lets them know. As for where to provide this, I'm not entirely sure, but pretty much any social media channel, whether that be the comments in YouTube videos, whether that be responses on Twitter, whether that be sending them direct messages, whether that be, I guess, going on Reddit, but just don't be a typical Reddit neckbeard. I think any of these channels should be appropriate ways of providing feedback and allowing us as a whole to guide the game in the correct direction. On top of this, too, simplifying game design alongside removing add-ons is sort of already achieving this. As I mentioned earlier, add-ons are sort of a community-led effort to reduce the skill floor. Now, if add-ons are removed, but at the same time the skill floor of the game itself is lowered, that in and of itself is almost a net neutral, depending on obviously how heavy they go one way or the other. And even amongst all of this, I think there is still quite a few areas where game depth can be maintained. Things like emphasis on pattern recognition in boss encounters rather than watching timers. So this is something that like Final Fantasy XIV does really well. I've never really played it, but this is the general feedback that I've heard. Maybe positional elements in encounters which force players to make snap decisions, like dodging easily visible ground mechanics. There could be a greater emphasis on CD usage, maybe pruning the defensives, but making not pressing them at the appropriate time more punishing. And then rotations that are challenging to master under the pressures of the game, but not super punishing on missed abilities. Like I said earlier, classes like Ret Paladin and Frost DK are doing this really well at the moment. A really, really bad game design that has plagued a lot of classes for years is having really complex rotations that, if they are not done correctly, result in like huge decreases in DPS. Like if you press abilities in a slightly wrong order, you do half the damage that you should be doing. That is not fun game design. We shouldn't need a PhD to be able to play certain specs. I think it'll definitely be interesting to see how Blizzard tackles this, and I just want to emphasize again that it's important for us as players to approach this with an open mind and provide constructive feedback throughout the process. I think Blizzard's intentions are sound, and I think they are putting in a lot more effort to listen to the community as a whole, but we do need to be providing that feedback to them. Nothing compares to the experience of actual players in the game. Anyway, I would love to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for hanging out. If you want to support the channel, check out the channel memberships below. Otherwise, until next time, gamers, take care.